In line with the national trend of moving welfare recipients into jobs, New York City 2 years ago began its Work Experience Program, popularly known as WEP. Not everyone has been happy with the experience. I'm David R. Jones, president of the Community Service Society of New York, a social services organization that fights for the rights of poor people. Today we will look at the issue of welfare to work, what its implications are for the greater society, as well as individuals directly affected. We have as our guest David Butler, Assistant Director of the Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation, MDRC as it's known, a national not-for-profit group that evaluates welfare experiments. At MDRC for 6 years, he is the resident expert to states and localities on welfare reform and coordinator of its national jobs program. Mr. Butler, the city administration claims it has placed 125,000 people in 2 years, but have any of them landed real jobs, or from your experience in other states, can they? Particularly when we really don't have any way to verify what's going on.
Well, the first thing I would say in recognition of the city's accomplishment here is that
Right.
New York is one of the few programs in the country that has mounted a large-scale workfare effort. Other places have tried to do this and have not been successful. Mm-hmm. The issue, however, of whether workfare leads to people leaving welfare and getting unsubsidized jobs, at least based on the research that we've done, doesn't suggest that this is the best avenue for people to get employed and leave welfare. It does provide some productive work for people. It enforces an obligation that someone do something in exchange for welfare. But the research doesn't suggest that it leads to people getting off the welfare rolls and moving into self-sufficiency or unsubsidized employment.
Well, the logical question, follow-up question is what would be the right way for municipalities to do this?
Well, it's a complex question because it depends not only on the characteristics of the people who are on welfare, the nature of the economy in those localities, the nature of the bureaucracy. But we've studied many programs over the years, and we see a number of features that we would that we would say are concomitants of successful initiatives. One thing is that it's very important that if people are participating in education and training, and we think that there should be participation in education and training, that it be very clear that the goal of those programs be employment. Mm-hmm. Very often education and training has its own reason for being. There's not a lot of focus on moving people from that activity into jobs. And the programs that have been more successful have really made the education and the training link up closely with the labor market through using job developers, through getting teachers who are in the field, through having the training be really work-based, through simulating a work environment in the training and the education world. And that kind of experience does seem to lead to people getting employed. Other characteristics are really an organization whose mission is about moving people to employment and whose management focuses on accomplishing that. The best program we ever evaluated was in Riverside County, California, where it was virtually an obsession with helping people get employed. There were performance standards for staff, performance standards for the county. The head of that organization really pushed the goal of employment. They used very good job clubs and job readiness activities, job developers. So when you went into that program, you knew from day one that the goal here was to get you off of welfare and get you into a job. I don't see that as the objective of New York City's program up until now. I think it's an objective that's achievable, but it so far has not been the focus of what we've seen here.
One of the run-ins that advocates like myself and the administration has had already is the concern over removing particularly younger people who are in various college programs and putting them in programs that really don't allow them to continue their college studies. Mm-hmm. What does the research show from your vantage point on that? Does college graduation have any long-term impact in employability? Is it a way out of dependency?
Well, it's an interesting question because, first of all, not that many welfare recipients go on and graduate college. I mean, we certainly know that for the society as a whole, the more education you get, the better your employment outcomes are. But the research on whether providing lots of education to welfare recipients, and whether that pays off in better jobs, is less clear. It seems to me, though, that from a public policy perspective, if someone is in college and making progress towards graduation and achieving those goals, it doesn't seem to me to be a cost-effective way of thinking about that investment, taking them out of that program and putting them in work experience. If, on the other hand, someone is going from program to program, which often happens in the world of education, it's very easy to get, there's financial incentives for many of the education institutions to recruit heavily, and if people are not accomplishing much in those education programs, then I think, this may be a better alternative. But certainly as a policy across the board, I don't think it makes good sense.
Now, in the city of New York, Felix Rohatyn and Mr. Kiley have come up with a notion that the city should focus on major infrastructure reconstruction as one of the ways to generate jobs for the welfare poor. In other words, start making WEP assignments or another iteration of WEP something that would come together with capital infrastructure redevelopment. Could that kind of effort work? In other words, could you talk about essentially a New York City-based WPA program that would have long-term impact on the viability of New York?
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly the WPA worked. It was the most successful job creation program we've ever had, and it got people employed and taught them real skills. It seems to me that it can work if there's sufficient investment to make it successful, if there's a commitment to make it happen. It's a costly endeavor. I think the notion of a combination of a collaboration of the private and public sector on this is appealing, because I think the finances can't all come from the public side here. If the private sector sees some opportunities to win here, and I think they would from some serious reinvestment strategy in the city, and are prepared to make some financial commitments towards that end, I think it could be a viable
On a recent visit that I had in Washington, we had a discussion with some of the White House people on the issue of welfare to work, and one of the concerns that was raised by a small group of us were that if you provided special incentives, cash incentives to private employers, that you might end up having other ancillary impacts on low-wage workers. We were raising the question, for instance, if there was a special bonus or paid to private employers who hired welfare, that they might just fire their existing low-wage workers and take the bonus and run, and leave the communities from which both groups came from in worse shape than it was. What is MDRC's view on this kind of problem?
I think the research generally on private subsidies, subsidies to private employers has not been especially encouraging. I think the problem has been maybe not so much the displacement issue you allude to, but the fact that we end up subsidizing employment placements that would have been made anyway. The problem has been that this becomes a windfall for the employer to make a hire that he would have made on his own. After all, many welfare recipients do go to work, and often in low-wage jobs. That's the pool from which employers are hiring anyway. And I think the danger in a broad-based private subsidy approach is that it will end up being a windfall for employers, but won't generate any new employment among welfare recipients. I don't think that across the board it's a bad strategy, but I think it has to be done in a more thoughtful way, in which the incentives are tied to working with, for example, particularly long-term recipients, or the incentives are tied to some commitments around longer-term job retention, which has been a problem for welfare recipients, or some wage progression. But simply a subsidy that's targeted to employers who hire welfare recipients is probably not a good strategy.
Is it your feeling, taking the city and the nation from which you have a perspective, that the economy can absorb, if the Republican Congress is right, the entire welfare population of adults into the workforce?
Yeah. Well, this is, of course, one of the dueling debates among the economists. I think probably the best thinking on this that I'm familiar with suggests that over time the economy could absorb this number of new employees. The question is rather what implications it would have for the economy. Gary Burtless at Brookings Institution Harry Holzer and others who've looked at this question, have basically concluded that this kind of large number of new entries into the workforce will have a declining effect on wages, which is what economic theory would predict.
Right.
And I think that that's the danger, because the problem right now is that welfare recipients are taking jobs at the very low end. Many of them don't have benefits.
Right.
Many of them are only temporary, and they don't lead to permanent exits from welfare. That problem, it seems to me, would be compounded if we're talking about 2 million welfare recipients who over a period of a couple of years would be entering the labor market. The jobs would get worse.
You know, in a recent discussion I had with members of the New York City Partnership, some of the larger employers in the city were making statements that basically they were still in downsizing mode. And that their requirements for workers was jumping further and further up. They mentioned in passing that, you know, Chrysler Auto was starting to look at 2 years of college as sort of the benchmark that they could demand now, with no particular impact on the wages paid. Is this going to be something we can see going through into the next century, that there's going to be less and less need for this kind of work?
I think we're seeing a bifurcation in the economy, in which the job growth is happening either at the very low end or at the high skilled end. I think now what's happening is that given that the economy in most of the country is doing very, very well, we're getting a somewhat false impression about what the opportunities are really out there for welfare recipients. And I think New York may be a harbinger of what we're going to see in the rest of the country as we, particularly in the Midwest, if the economy worsens. I think what's happening now is that there is a labor shortage, and as a result, employers will reach out to welfare recipients. But once recessionary mode hits again, what's likely to happen is you'll have people with higher credentials, better qualifications, competing for these same jobs and willing to accept lower wages. And I think once you face that scenario, then the opportunities for this reform become much more problematic.
I thought the Fed chairman, however, was promising that we'd never have a recession again.
Well, I'm not sure even the Fed chairman can really guarantee that.
What if you were sort of the sort of supervisor of all jobs programs across the nation, what would you see as the kind of things, the benchmarks you'd look for in terms of creating a first-class jobs program? What would it look like? Would it be raking leaves? Or would there be job categories at all? What would it be like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, firstly, I would not. I would use some of the things that New York City is doing. I think there is a place for mandatory work in welfare to work programs. I think there's a legitimacy to the notion that there should be some quid pro quo for getting welfare benefits. The problem is whether it's a fair exchange, it seems to me. I mean, what we have now in New York, we have welfare recipients who are really doing the jobs of city employees, and yet are getting only a welfare grant in exchange for that. So that takes me in two directions. If you're going to use this model as the base, then either you need to start paying people more for doing this kind of work, or alternatively, you have to think about it in different ways as a training ground to move people off of welfare into unsubsidized employment. And in order to accomplish that, then I think you have to think a little bit differently about the way the WEP program is structured. WEP now is really focused on accomplishing important work that the city needs done. But it's not focused especially on how you can meet the needs of the individual welfare clients and play to their strengths and help develop their skills and build their experience in a way in which they can get a job that's off of welfare. And I think if that structural change took place, and if the program, for example, built in more group activities related to job clubs and job readiness, if it used job developers, if it thought more about getting people into positions in fields where there were likely to be jobs, then I think it would be a better approach.
For instance, I know when we talk to some of the WEP people that even if they have perfect attendance and they excel in what they're doing, it doesn't seem to be recorded anywhere. In other words, that the fact that they had done stellar work, they couldn't sort of create their own resume of something to take to another employer. And I guess that's part of the issue involved.
I think that's a very important point. The programs that I've seen where they've really focused on trying to make these WEP placements into real opportunities have had very close supervision, and the supervisors have been kind of job coaches and advocates for the recipients.
Right.
They've really seen this as, they've seen the work experience as a way in which they can try to market someone who's in that job. And LA, for example, is doing some of this where they have job developers working very closely with work experience participants to build a resume, to sell those skills. And I think it can be done. It so far, however, has not been the focus, at least for the home relief caseload. My sense is that the vision in the city is a little bit different for AFDC, and there are more opportunities in that program.
We've talked a lot about the private sector. We haven't talked about the not-for-profit sector. What is your research seeming to show? Is there potential for augmenting not-for-profits who are also obviously in need of work and workers?
Well, I think that the work experience program, which, as I understand it, to some extent makes placements in the non-for-profit sector in New York,
right,
could certainly expand more in that direction. And there are examples of programs in Milwaukee and Vermont that have really focused their work experience on the not-for-profit sector. And I think the philosophy has been that the not-for-profit sector is in a position in which they have a kind of historical commitment to working with welfare recipients to try to move them to self-sufficiency. They've also the government has tied the availability of work experience recipients to guarantees around job hires.
Right.
So there needs to be some quid pro quo around that as well.
The latest sort of flurry of activity around the WEP controversy has been around the issue of unionization. Whether these are really employees, whether they have certain rights to everything from OSHA, job protection, to minimum wage. How does that play out? Can this program even work if it requires full workers' benefits?
Well, it's an interesting question. We'll have to see how that plays out. I think it's kind of interesting if you think of the history of the work experience program in New York. In fact, it has been in place for a number of years. And when I worked, before I came to MDRC, I worked for the Koch administration in Human Resources Administration. We had a large work experience program. We had about 13,000 men participating, about 7,000 women in the program. During those years, the unions were willing to accept this. There were no, major opposition was not raised to the program. And I think what's happened is it's now become so large and so visible that it's no longer possible for the unions to ignore this. It seems to me that if unionization could be a good thing, I mean, in that for welfare recipients it could mean a job that's a transition between welfare and a good-paying, unsubsidized job. Whether it's something that it doesn't help the existing unionized workforce because it deflates their wages.
Right.
And from the city's perspective, I'm not sure there's a commitment to be willing to pay the kinds of wages, even if they're not the wages of current municipal employees.
Yeah, I guess, some of the horror stories we hear, obviously, of which are OSHA violations of people being given assignments and garbage collection without gloves or proper shoes. Even a death occurred around that. The segregation of these workers without places to change as being somehow not being considered full employees, so they couldn't have lockers. I guess those are the kinds of concerns. We also obviously have heard the sort of gratuitous insults. The case I keep using is of a former sonar chief from the Russian submarine service who had been the lead of nuclear submarine work of this sort, who was removed from his ESL program, English as a Second Language program, and forced to rake leaves as his assignment precisely at the same time when ESL was to be taught. I guess those kinds of things have left a certain bitter taste. I think once having said that, however, there is a lot of interest if you could come up, and I think WPA is a constant rejoinder of how this might go. But we talked a little about the economy. New York, of course, has 10.1% unemployment. Community Service Society just finished a recent report that we're just releasing now that found some real difficulties in terms of how many workers might be absorbed. What do you see the parameters in terms of the willingness of Congress and states to start to engage in the fact that some of the ideas they had originally may not work out, that you may need a permanent public jobs sector? Yeah. Is there enough public sentiment or political will to come up with a miniature or not so miniature version of WPA?
I think it's a little soon to tell. There certainly are organizations out there that are lobbying strongly for this. The Citizens Budget Committee in Washington and the Budget and Policy Priorities, CLASP, other national organizations have proposals for transitional WPA types of initiatives. So far, I don't see many states who are ready or interested in moving into that mode. But I think a lot of this will depend on what happens around time limits and whether states are really prepared in large numbers to throw welfare recipients off at the time limit if they're not employed. And based on the research, it's pretty clear that there are going to be many of people who are not going to be able to leave welfare before time limits hit. And the question is, what is government going to do at that point? Are they going to blink? Are they really seriously going to implement a time limit? And I think the alternative to implementing a time limit and terminating benefits is to implement a time limit and follow it by a work requirement for some kind of permanent job in which, or at least temporary job that's government supported, as Clinton originally proposed in his welfare reform. So we'll have to see.
Now you're leading a special project for MDRC that's taking a look at some major cities and issues of displacement. And can you describe what that's going to be about and what you're seeking to find out?
Yeah, we're running a project called Urban Change, which is looking at the effects of welfare reform on large cities and poor neighborhoods in those large cities and poor people in those communities. The cities that have agreed to participate in this project are Philadelphia, Cleveland, Los Angeles, and Miami. We may add a couple of more cities. You know, at this point, we really don't know how this welfare reform is going to play out. We all have our own political druthers on this and what we think is going to happen. Some of us think it's going to be a disaster. Other people think it's going to free up all of this new energy and create new jobs. And this study is really going to try to get a handle on what those effects really are and who they affect, because I think different people are going to be affected differently by this welfare reform. Some people may be better off. Other people may be hurt significantly. It's going to be the net effects of how different people are affected and how different communities are affected that will really tell us where this has taken us.
How long do you think before you'll get some indication of what's going on? This study is going to go on for...
Well, it's a five-year study, right? However, within a year or so, we'll start reporting on implementation findings and whether programs are actually changing, what's happening at the community level. In terms of its effects and impacts on families, it'll take longer to see that.
What kind of data will you be focusing on in this study, and what kind of changes are you looking for?
Well, at the individual and family level, we would hope to see if this approach to welfare reform is successful, that more people will go to work, that employment rates will increase, that job retention rates will increase, that people will begin to move to self-sufficiency. On the other hand, if people don't go to work and aren't employed, then we would be interested in finding out, well, what are they doing? Are they becoming homeless? What implications does this have for children and families? Are people hungry? Are they moving? Are they forming new kinds of relationships and kinship relationships to try to compensate for the loss of income from welfare? And then at the community level, we'll step back and say, well, what's happening in poor neighborhoods? People who live in these neighborhoods who are spending their welfare dollars in these communities. Is this affecting the ability of businesses to continue? Is it affecting safety in the neighborhood? Things like that.
We're obviously already getting some concern over the housing issue, particularly as to how, as the squeeze begins, not only the time limits, but actually the amounts of money going to the welfare recipient, how they'll be able to sustain even a bare habitation. and how will the landlords in those communities really sustain it, because you've also got other impacts that are coming down. Clearly, HUD deregulation, the cutback and deep subsidy programs. We see an intersection on a local level, obviously, of a lot of this. In your studies of other cities, one of the great fears by the advocacy community is that we may be on the eve of what's been described as the Brazilianization of urban America, of essentially a golden central city with enormous resources, our Wall Street theoretically, or Manhattan, lower Manhattan, surrounded by favelas, basically, of slums where people don't have enough wherewithal to do anything. That clearly is the most extreme example. But we have seen signs, obviously, in the 70s when you did see rapid rises in homelessness and abandonment. Is that going to be on the radar screen? Will that be picked up here?
We're certainly going to look at those factors.
Right.
I think a lot of this is dependent, and we don't know on what states and cities are really going to do.
Right.
You, for example, don't have legislation in New York yet. We don't know whether New York is actually going to have time limits, although it seems like that's likely to be part of the package. But even if there are time limits in the policy, I mean, policy is really determined by how it gets implemented. And what we've been observing when we look at programs of time-limited welfare, a lot of the power really rests with individual workers who are making decisions about who's going to be cut off and who's not going to be cut off. So it's kind of difficult at this point to look at the policy and really get a good sense on how it's going to play out. We really have to watch the implementation first. But we'll certainly be looking at factors related to housing and to see whether we do, in fact, get the Brazilianization of New York or some such.
What about things about foreign competition and how this all plays out against it? Obviously, one argument for this is that if you lower the wages for low-wage workers, that this will make the United States more competitive against developing countries, and we can start to redress this and bring more jobs back in. Any thoughts on is that true?
Well, I don't know whether it's true or not. I know there are certainly some programs that have that are imbued with that philosophy and approach. There's a program called Index in Oklahoma, which is actually a work experience program that's being run in the private sector. And it's being run in a community where they lost lots of jobs to the Far East because the wages were just too high. And now they're using work experience recipients who are getting their welfare checks, and it's being run by the Chamber of Commerce. Now, the challenge is, will this simply be exploitation of
bringing the third world
into the first world, right? Or will these become real jobs for people? And there are pressures to try to make sure that there's a job guarantee down the road, but we don't know yet how that's going to play out. You're going to see lots of examples of this, I think.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. There are many factors that argue against an easy transition from welfare to work for the 205,000 people the city classifies as employable. Most are without a high school diploma that even the most low-skilled jobs now require. They lack the work experience and job readiness skills that employers most prize. And through no fault of their own, the jobs are not there. New York City has never fully recovered the hundreds of thousands of jobs lost in the 1989 recession. Even today, the unemployment rate is 10.1%. There are 8 job applicants for each opening. We need a dedicated effort by government and private companies and the not-for-profits to create jobs for welfare workers that make a meaningful difference in their lives and ours. This is David R. Jones. Thank you for joining us on the Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. area code 212-254-8900.